Well, happy Friday to you, Scott Baker.
It is Friday, October 17th, 2025, Mikey, and we are up to field note number 1590 that we're talking about on today's edition of Lead Better. And the title is You're Doing Great So Far.
Yeah.
Okay. And, we've been doing field notes for 4 years. We've been doing these conversations for a couple of years. I think we're doing great so far.
Yes. Right. So this particular statement is something that is inspired not by the Homer Simpson meme, right? So for those of you who are steeped in internet culture, if you have seen this particular meme before, this is not where this comes from.
Yes,
the
right.
worst day of my life, and Homer, in his fatherly wisdom, trying to comfort him by saying,
To comfort him.
"So far."
Okay, all right. We should just stop now because that actually makes the entire point better than anything else we could say. So that was a big surprise. Thank you for that. So but the magic here, regardless of the meme, is what is the power of two little words?
Yes.
So far.
Right, exactly. And where does it come from is this conversation about a real paradox that leaders have between their need to be optimistic and their need to be realistic as well, right? Because there are tremendous advantages for people who are always optimistic, but there are drawbacks. And there are tremendous advantages for people who are, very realistic in the way that they see things, in the way that they communicate, but there's always drawbacks as well. So what is the formula that we've talked about in the past that is the right formula of 3 parts optimism and 1 part skepticism, right? So always optimistic about, what was it? It was in a former field note about people. It's not about strategy. It's about...
Yeah. Hold on 1 second, because I have, obviously a photographic memory and all 1,590 field notes. I can just retrieve it to find out.
Right.
I'm sorry. That file is unavailable in my head right this second. Sorry.
I pulled it up while you were making that joke. So
okay,
optimistic about people, optimistic about the future, optimistic about challenges faced by the team, skeptical about execution, right?
So or skeptical could also just be realistic, as you indicated earlier.
Right. And so this notion of using the word "so far," deployed the way that it's recommended here, kind of carries that formula for us, right?
Yeah, right.
We're saying you're doing great, right? Which makes me optimistic so about far. About your results so far, right?
But, and I don't know that I fully realized this. Maybe you hadn't either. But a friend of mine who's a real addicted to field notes and studies them, looks at them, breaks them apart. Actually, just ran an analysis of the entire catalog of all of them, and there were of the themes that are kind of the common themes across field notes. One of the most common themes in all of our field notes over 4 years is this balance between optimism and realism. So if you're looking at the undercurrent and you're thinking about, well, what are the things that constitute the best leaders in the way that they walk around? Not a behavior that we would talk about in terms of specific behaviors, but in terms of just a mindset and an attitude, a framework for looking at the world. How am I doing? Am I balancing optimism with realism? And then this question is, how are you expressing that to the team, which was the things that you were pointing at? And so I think that's really where it gets so interesting about, well, can 2 little words really make such a big difference? And right. Yeah, they can.
Yeah, and it's a shame that there's not more encouragement or education around this in business school, because the core of MBA really is about taking somebody's business model and deconstructing it, right? Showing us all the things that are wrong with it. And that is the type of exercise that MBA students go through over and over and over again, right? And so during their course of study, in a lot of ways, all they're going to do is be negative, right? Because that's just basically the way you get your reps in, by deconstructing something and just being negative about what won't work, right? And as a result of that, I think perhaps those who go through those types of programs end up being our future leaders, And we have a small default that we've set in them to constantly be skeptical and negative, right? And so where you get that optimism from is not going to be in business school. So you need to find it somewhere else, because people do want optimistic leaders in their life.
Yeah. And one of the things that we know, and I remember, I don't know, it was back in the 80s or 90s, reading a book by Deborah Tannen, and she's I don't know, she's a linguist. She analyzes language. I remember the book that was the bestseller back then was about how women and men use words differently, and I haven't tracked all of her research, but one of the things that she kind of would refer to at different times was that little words like actually have sort of a powerful effect on how we frame things.
Sure.
And so you as a leader need to be thinking about the way you're using language. And so these things in the field note, it talks about this temporal framing, like this temporal effect of like, all right, we're seeing now things in terms of time, right? That's what so far is giving us. And you're giving this expectation. And for example, let's say I could have, during the Steelers-Bengals game last night, which I watched late in my hotel room, I could have said at the end of the first quarter or midway through the second quarter, "You're doing great," to the Pittsburgh Steelers so far.
Yeah.
And then, things didn't work out after that, but there were already some signs of trouble that were bubbling even when it was 10-0 before they ended up losing the game. So, but you can see if you actually had been saying that, like there could have been, I don't know. There could have been a cockiness, like, "Hey, we're doing great. Like we can coast on this. Like this team that we're playing, a team that's done terribly. They don't even have their main quarterback. The guy they got in there is ancient, and so we can just kind of ride it out. We're good." And then all of a sudden, right? But if a coach says, "Listen, we're doing great so far," that takes the conversation in a different direction. Where are we really? Right? So we've got the optimism, but we have to balance it with the realism.
Yeah, and that's true of the NFL of the last couple seasons more than anything. There's no lead that is safe anymore in the second half. And I think most of that has to do with the kind of adjustments that coaches are able to make during halftime and put on the field in very short order. And coaches and teams have learned how to do that. Those halftime adjustments are great. And so this notion of like resting on the so far versus allowing it to be the fact that we are making adjustments here. You could do both of those things with that flexible phrase. And it's an important one there.
Yeah. And now the next part of what the field note then talks about is, it's not just saying so far, like, "Hey, we're being optimistic, we're being a little bit realistic." It's pairing that with some evidence, with some facts, with some reasons, right? It's bringing in the logic into this, saying, here's what's happening. We're doing great so far. Probably we did this and we did this and we got this. Looks like what we'll probably need to do next is this, this, and this, right? So I think that that's the thing that you as a leader, and I think that what comes through in this field note is, are you this kind of leader all the time? Right? Are you the one that's saying this, always kind of giving a check on where we're going? And can you get everybody kind of like, "That was great, doing good, looks good so far, that's great. Where are we next?" Right? And you're always tying it back to the evidence, to the facts. And I think that combination is the thing that becomes really powerful. And I think it also, when you're kind of talking about it that way, it makes people feel like you, the leader, are part of the team on where we are. It's not like you're just distant, like pronouncing from Mount Olympus. And when teams feel like the project is fully owned by all of them, it sort of endows them with a different power of sort of possession to say, "Okay, we are now responsible for getting this over the finish line."
Right. So I'm trying to think back to coaches from when I was a kid, or leaders that I may have had later in life who commonly used this sentiment. They may not have used the word like this as a behavior. But I do remember, like, the best coaches that I had in high school kind of had this feeling. Now, they wouldn't necessarily use "so far," but or "great so far," or anything so far. They would just always leave room for testing and improvement. They would always leave room for the fact that you're going to get better, right? And That's the value in this phrase. Like just two little words here that can put you in that frame of reference. Now, you could say it in a negative way. Like we brought up how the way Homer says it, right?
Yeah, right.
And emphasizing in a negative way. And I think the pairing that you mentioned is great, right? And those coaches that I had in high school were the ones who really introduced me to statistics in a way that got me very excited.
Interesting.
Going into the next game, wanting to like get a record or improve my percentage of free throws, right? And they were constantly talking about those types of things. And so that kind of thing paired with the idea of like, great so far, right? Was always with the notion of like looking at the record of rebounds per game that was held by, Deanie Sosa for so long. And it wasn't until my senior year I really had the opportunity to like take a crack at that record. But it was something I was thinking about forever, right?
Interesting. Yeah.
So the so far and the statistics.
And there's a target. Yeah, there's a target.
Right.
One other thing I wanted to add into this and see if this makes some sense, which is, we talked about a couple of weeks ago. I can't remember what the words were. I kind of said, look, they're not an incantation. Right? So you don't have to expect to be like, all right, team. And then I think you're doing great so far. Right. And then expect all of a sudden that it's just going to magically happen. There are magic phrases. There are magic words. And I don't know if it was in one of our sessions. We're at a team meeting right now yesterday, or if I heard it on a podcast, but I remember that somebody saying, well, there's a phrase that means this. And it was like a 2-word phrase. And I went, oh, that's really interesting. Like that phrase. And I have it in my notes because I know I wrote it down. I just can't remember what section it was in. And so it's good, by the way, to keep a journal of these things, to keep kind of a list of things that pop out of you as just phrases, because you're going to forget little pieces. But when you may not go, let me go back and search through the October field notes for whatever that was. Right. Just kind of put in the power of so far into a journal that you review every couple of weeks or every couple of months. And you'll find yourself just kind of using it more just fluidly and fluently. Yeah. Now, the one thing that you could say about so far, though, is you shouldn't be looking at this as a hedge, right? In the sense that we do know in the linguistic aspects of leadership communication that there are expressions that have a confidence and there are expressions that have a diffidence. And we know when we're hearing leaders who are always putting these caveats, and some of us, and I think I sometimes have a tendency to do this, where we weaken our own message, we undercut it because we're trying to say we add, well, maybe, and here's a scenario, and it could possibly be this, and there's, I'd like you to think about this or here, and whereas sometimes you just need to have the confidence to say, here's where it is. Right. And people that actually say that. And that's why even little expressions like the uptalk of like, I think we're doing well.
Yes.
Well, that actually doesn't sound, because I inflected up, doesn't sound like I think we're doing well.
Yeah.
Totally different message.
You make me think that we should have a product like that, like a word of the day calendar, right? Where you're carrying off a sheet and you're trying to use that word in common conversation throughout the day, because maybe it's a unique word that you haven't used very much. Maybe it's something that you've taught. But the whole reason that people do that is because they want to increase their vocabulary, which is a fine pursuit. But we're leadership people, right? We want to get better at leadership. And so if we had a phrase of the day, a leadership phrase of the day that you're instituting, here we've got so far, if we sorted back.
So far, here we've got so far.
Yeah, we've got 1,500 field notes. I wonder how many phrases that we can pop out of this, because it might be too difficult of a thing to create 365 of those things. If we were actually going to be creating it, we would want these phrases to be inculcated in our life in such a way.
Oh yeah.
Coming back to them over and over. And so
and one thing to think about there is we pointed out that and there are things that are in our field notes. We also have things that have come through 30 years of research that we have in our sort of main playbook of admired leader behaviors that are more detailed, more nuanced, but very, very powerful. But all of these things are behaviors. Now, a lot of times in field notes, we deal with things that are just good advice, or they're insightful, or there's a framework, or there's an attitude, and also really valuable, but in sort of different categories. But one thing that we've talked about recently was that when you say there's a behavioral view of leadership as opposed to a psychological view, where it's just, how am I being authentic to myself, and do I really understand the feelings of my team? All of those things are important. But when we talk about behavior, I've kind of used that thing, can I watch you do it? Can I see it? What would it look like on video? And they almost all of the behaviors tend to be something that is an expression. It's not just in our head, right? So it's something we physically are doing, or the words that we're using. It's actions and words, actions and words. And so when you think of how many times there's a question or a particular phrase or a particular thing that you're going to make your point in this way, those are sometimes behaviors. And what constitutes in my leader behaviors that we actually think that they're universally applicable, like that we've watched them across multiple leaders in multiple scenarios. Sometimes in field notes, there's a great phrase. It might not work in every circumstance for every person, but it might be valuable. And so I'm just giving you the categories. But to think about the fact that the questions we ask, the statements we make, the way that we do them, and the phrases we use can have more enormous power, perhaps more than we even expect. And that's where this field note falls into that category.
Right, exactly. And better than just improving your vocabulary too. There's a useful thing. Yeah.
Great. Yep.
All right. Thank you for your time today. We'll talk to you this weekend.
And we'll hopefully do even better than we did today.
Yeah, so far.
All right.
All right.